Something fun I've been doing since my big PC upgrade to a 7800X3D and 5070 Ti and my little return to making YouTube videos is going back and playing old games I used to benchmark in the beginning of my channel. It's fun going back and seeing how this powerful high-end hardware can run on games that were designed on much lower specs. Max Payne's, Far Cry's, Tomb Raiders, Red Dead's. One of my most popular vids, and one of the only ones to break 1 million, was based on a similar concept, 9900K and 2080 Ti versus Crysis. I always enjoy the idea of taking a game designed for a GTX 680, 2GB of RAM, and giving it a chance to really run with no limitations, really stretch its wings on a GPU from today. So in keeping with this theme, I decided to replay a game that has it where it counts in the graphics department, but maybe was remembered as kind of a flop. Maybe there's a diamond in the rough here. I haven't played Bioshock Infinite since it launched with much anticipation at the beginning of 2013, and I remember being conflicted on it. On one hand, it was this marveling piece of eye candy in a fantastical floating city with some of the intrigue and some of the same marvel of the first Bioshock, but on the other hand, I remember it being, well, not fun. With the exception of using it to benchmark older hardware in the past, I've never really given it a second look, and I figured it was about time. This brings me to my pivot for this episode. Yes, record scratch. Time for why do you need a freaking 5090 to play video games at any kind of resolution at 60 frames a second in 2025 when they barely look any better than games that ran on GTX 680 from 2013? I was going to do a similar video essay on Bioshock, reviewing its gameplay and story and, running it on crazy hardware from 2025 and reviewing the whole experience, much like my Crysis and Max Payne retrospectives of past. However, my findings on the graphics of Bioshock Infinite got me thinking once I started watching reviews for Borderlands 4. Now, I've never played Borderlands Borderlands 2. The original games flew under my radar. I tried Borderlands 3 for a little bit and was going to add it to my benchmarking back in the day, but it didn't hook me enough to keep playing. I was thinking of 4, maybe I would give it a shot if it reviewed well. Gameplay aside, just focusing on the graphics of Borderlands 4, from what I've seen, Bioshock Infinite can absolutely give it a run for its money. Heck, they're both developed under 2K using the Unreal Engine, so one could share distant DNA from the other. Borderlands has a cel-shaded visual art style. Although Bioshock Infinite's art style is not cel-shaded per se, I would call it almost Disney cartoon-esque. There are definite similarities between the way Borderlands and Bioshock Infinite tries to present its style, and there's definite similarities between Elizabeth's character model and Elle from Beauty and the Beast, and so on. So both games have a cartoon comic book style over a realistic one, and both games try to marry realism and cartoon to make you feel more interested and immersed in their environment. At a glance, you might mistake assets from one to the other. The cel-shaded style is rather subdued in Borderlands 4, and it's all pretty cartoony. So I'm about halfway through Bioshock Infinite, cranked at 4K, getting 300 to 400 plus FPS maxed out, and these Borderlands 4 reviews start dropping, saying even the RTX 5090 is having trouble running it at 4K 30 frames a second natively. I'm watching these visuals in these videos and I'm flabbergasted. I swear Bioshock Infinite looks just as good. It's a game from 2013 with minimum specs like the Core 2 Duo or Athlon X2 processor, 2 gigs of RAM and a Radeon HD 3870 or NVIDIA 8800 GT with half a gig of video memory. Like, this is crazy. I swear PC video gaming peaked in 2019, and ever since then NVIDIA has been cramming RTX down our throats. Everything's just been stagnant with all kinds of ray tracing and lumens and nanites and AI, and it's just all there to force you to try and upgrade your PC. Now, I'm not dumb. I understand there is a hell of a lot more to it than that. Bioshock Infinite was one of the first DirectX 11 titles. Heck, it still worked under DX10. Borderlands 4 is a current-gen game running on Unreal Engine 5, and the technology behind it is impressive. I think if you're going for realistic, it's the engine of choice these days. Borderlands, however, is a cel-shaded comic book game, and it's going to be really tricky to use the state-of-the-art features of Unreal Engine 5 to their full potential. But maybe you just have to play it to see it. Maybe the videos on YouTube can't do it justice. Worst part is, Borderlands 4 is not on Game Pass. It's $89.99 in Canada on Steam. I really don't know if that's worth it. So I made a deal with myself. I would buy it to review it, and if it's not good and I'm not super glued to it within 1 hour and 59 minutes, I can just return it on Steam. Isn't that great? This will also give me the opportunity to get some real side-by-side comparisons versus Bioshock Infinite, which I'm pretty much done now with. And I can draw a real conclusion. Is this nanite virtualized high-detail geometry lumen for dynamic global illumination and world persistent systems building massive open worlds to improve collaboration via all file one and actor approach? It's all the features of Unreal 5. Is that worth it? You know, for the cost of the hardware these days? For the toll it takes on your wallet? Well, I think that's worth a deep dive, and hold on to your butts, because I've got an old to new take on Bioshock Infinite, its troubled development past, its need for a remake, and about 15 hours of gameplay footage. We're going to go through that and catalyze and explain why there's no excuse for a game these days to launch poorly optimized like Borderlands 4 has. This is a RTX 5070 Ti and 7800X3D versus Bioshock Infinite versus Borderlands 4 versus Convolutions, and that's the beginning of the end of the intro. Take it away, TJ. Big Daddy. I guess we better start all the way back in 2007 with the launch of Bioshock. And yes, let's get this out of the way. There will be spoilers for the entire Bioshock series. It's old. Get over it. The minute I saw the gameplay trailer with the big daddies and little sisters, the underwater world, I knew I had to play that game. It was quite the smash hit at the time, and I played it on PC the minute I could, probably on some lower end hardware. The environment, the lore, the twist ending, it all had me hooked at the time, and it was considered one of the best looking games to date. It was also designed to run on the Xbox 360 or PS3, so it ran exceptionally well on mid-range PC hardware at launch. Bioshock 2 was more of an extension of 1, so fast forward 6 years later, and I was absolutely ready for another Bioshock, and boy howdy was Ken Levine and Irrational Games about to rock our worlds. You see, at E3 2011, 2K and Irrational Games released a gameplay demo, end quote, of the big next Bioshock game, and it really blew everyone's minds. Take a look at this footage, at this gameplay, at this video. It's incredible. The problem is, for those of you who might not have been around or don't remember, 2K was literally making them fabricate this whole demo for a hype wagon. It looks similar to the real Bioshock Infinite game, however, the gameplay shown is just too ambitious, it's too complex. The physics of what's going on are just not possible, even on high-end hardware at the time. Games typically had loading screens. Computers simply didn't have the computing power or the memory to be transitioning on these rails like they are in this demo. The figures are using physics sims that are simply too complicated to render live, and the amount of AI enemies on the screen looks impressive even for today. It's all very ambitious, however, Ken Levine's ambition showed no bounds, and eventually the studio had to rein him in. At the end of the demo, this says, "This trailer was made entirely from in-game footage." I believe this to be true, however, the problem is it was probably running on an Intel Xeon E5 2690, 32 gigs of DDR3, and an NVIDIA GTX 590. Yeah, for those of you keeping score, that's an 8-core, 16-threaded processor, a dual GPU with 3 gigs of RAM, and all this in 2011. This game was intended to run on Xbox 360, which has a 3-core IBM PowerPC processor and 10 megabytes of embedded RAM and half a gigabyte of DDR3 memory. It's just not easy to take all these ambitions and shrink them down into the power that was available at the time. So Bioshock Infinite and Ken Levine somehow had to work together, and after many delays, Bioshock Infinite gets released in early 2013. If you compare the gameplay trailer from 2 years earlier to the gameplay we got, it's really easy to see how things got scaled back. This is where I can prove my first point. The engine, the ideas, the physics was all too far ahead of its time and compromises had to be made. This could have led to a game that was unpolished, buggy, and had performance issues. This could have led to a game like Borderlands 4 or Crysis, where the ambition led to poor reviews over the game being too hard to play on the technology available. But no, Bioshock Infinite launched to praise and played well on the very same hardware Bioshock 1 was launched on, the PS3 and Xbox 360. That is impressive. It ran at 30 frames a second on these consoles and lower-end PC hardware of the time, but everyone was kind of playing at 30 FPS back then anyways, at 1680 by 1050, so it's not like it was as well optimized as Half-Life 2 or something, but you can check out charts from the time on TechSpot, and of course, my main man Steve Walton has Hardware Unboxed style graphs and charts to show every single video card of the time running this game. He did complain, however, that the game had poor frame times, and it led to Bioshock playing worse than the FPS would have let on. So this wildly gigantic concept for a video game was held back by the technology of its time, and they still managed to release a very well-made game. But how does it feel to play Bioshock Infinite on an ultra mega computer in 2025? 12 years after it launched? Pretty good. I will break this down into two categories: gameplay and story versus graphics. Let's get the story and gameplay out of the way, and I'll start with the gameplay because this is the most disappointing thing about Bioshock Infinite. It's not that you can't feel that there's an amazing game in there. You get the feeling that Ken Levine's vision is there. The beginning mirrors the original game: a lighthouse, a fantastic journey, a blast into the sky instead of the sea in a tiny vessel, and the intro really does a good job of going big. It's about an hour into the game where you start exploring Colombia and start looking a little closer, a little further into things, and you kind of see the big show. It starts getting a little bit empty and not so fleshed out. The NPCs are scarce, and the interactability of the world is just kind of last gen. You know, the turn on the sink, flush the toilet kind of stuff. Rapture felt lived in and ruined. Columbia feels, well, like a set built for an amusement park. The gunplay is solid, and it's fluid, and the movement is generally pretty good, except for you kind of just get bumped and stuck into things all the time. But playing on a 240Hz monitor at hundreds and hundreds of frames a second made the combat feel no worse than Borderlands. I find the vigors were boring. They basically replace any kind of throwable item like a grenade or a Molotov, and they make you get an electric power to power a tram, and then you go through all this rigmarole for it, and they never use this electric mechanic again. It's all half-baked, and I think it was all in an attempt to quickly pivot from this unmakeable, fantastical version from 2011 to a finished, polished product in 2013. Now, as for the story, it certainly reaches for the skies. The original Bioshock was so good, and the twist was such an M. Night Shyamalan type thing that it would be so hard for Irrational Games to live up to it. They certainly tried, and I think they succeeded. The problem is the story of Booker being Comstock, the story of Elizabeth being Booker's daughter, the story of everything leading to Columbia bombing New York in the 80s, in the past, in the future, and the finger missing. Well, it's all complicated enough that it took me about 12 years to really understand it. Like, it's still confusing, but I finally get it. That isn't always a bad thing, I guess. It took me watching Donnie Darko about 10 times before I understood that movie. When it's said and done, I think the original vision for Bioshock Infinite might have helped the story flesh itself out a little more, and if there was a remake, this game could really change how it's remembered, but I'll make the case for the remake later. Let's summarize the gameplay and story, and they were limited by the technology of their time. The combat is as good as some titles being launched today, but the world is separated by loading screens, the NPCs are sparse, the world doesn't feel lived in, and the game just feels compromised by the limitations of RAM, DRAM, and the number of cores in your CPU. That's what makes the graphics part of this so impressive. I argue this is one of the most visually impressive titles of all time, especially when you bring it into 2025. It can look as impressive as Borderlands 4, and I would argue that it looks better than the game Atomfall, which has an extremely similar look and vibe that launched earlier this year. Now that's a AA game, and Bioshock was a triple. However, 12 years separate these games, and you can tell Atomfall was going for the Bioshock feel. Bioshock is 18 gigabytes on PC, and the textures never really look that bad. Most games these days are 60 to 200 gigabytes because the shaders and textures are so huge. Trying to find a jaggy edge or a low pixel count texture, Bioshock just seems to hide them with some sort of dithering effects that it applies before the textures make it to your eyes. It's hard to see how low res they are. Meanwhile, Borderlands grass looks like this on medium. So my point is simple. As limited as Bioshock Infinite ended up being, it can still hold its own with titles launched today. It's scaled from playing on what sounds like archaic hardware with less than a gig of VRAM all the way to today running at 4K 400 frames a second and looks amazing while doing it. Meanwhile, we have a game like Borderlands 4 that doesn't look or do that much better than Bioshock, but it needs FrameGen, DLSS, and all this other stuff to run well on modern hardware. Meanwhile, if you're 2 or 3 gens old, you can't even take advantage of some of those cheat codes, so it gets even worse off. So let's switch gears and talk about Borderlands. I've played about an hour and a half of it in my 2-hour limit so far, so I think I've got an idea of the gameplay, of the graphics, and its performance, and then we'll tie it all back to Bioshock in the end. Borderlands 4 is fine. I think it's probably receiving as much hate as it is because, number one, Gearbox boss Randy Pitchford decided to do the Todd Howard thing and just tell us we're dumb for not upgrading our computers and this is how gaming is. Just get used to it. But number two, there's just a lot of PC gaming fans who cannot afford to upgrade these days, and they want to play the games with the nostalgia, their old favorite games, but the new version. I literally have a buddy at work who loves the Borderlands games and played the old ones with his friends online. He's holding off on buying 4 because he only has an i5-8600 and an RTX 2070. When he started asking me about Borderlands 4, I assured him that those specs would be able to play it. It just made sense to me, just at lower settings maybe, or lower resolution or something. But after the launch and how bad this game works, he flat out refuses to spend the 90 Canadian dollars to be a guinea pig just to find out that this doesn't play well on his hardware. Gearbox could absolutely spend some time optimizing this game. It's only going to sell them more copies. And at first glance, in the darker sections of this game, it doesn't really even seem like we need nanite or lumen and all this extra stuff. The cel-shaded textures are just not good surfaces to use complex lighting with. Generally, while running around, you don't see a huge upgrade over playing Borderlands 2 on similar hardware. It's when you get to the level after Diego from Dora the Explorer kills himself, the island beach level, that you start seeing some of the beauty and the extra effects that the engine brings. I wanted to test this all for myself, so I ran the game on my son's Ryzen 3600 with an RTX 3060 Ti. This hardware is mid-range by today's standards, and it's a little better than my buddy's old i5 and RTX 2070, especially for DLSS. Keep in mind that the 30 series and before can't do frame gen, so all these tricks are useless for those relying on old hardware. So how does it run on my son's system? I will say that it's the bare minimum specs you'd want to run this game on. It loaded at 1080p, and even though the desktop resolution is set to 1440p, and it wouldn't let me increase the resolution. I'm sure there's an easy fix for this, but I just, the option wasn't there. And even though I was able to pull off 60 frames a second, a 1080p medium with some DLSS on the 3060 Ti, there was a lot of stuttering, and the game just didn't feel great. I mean, it was natively playing at 720 or something. So my buddy with the 2070 and the CPU with only 6 threads, I think I'll tell him to wait before spending the $90. Conclusion on Borderlands 4: it needs some patching, it needs some optimization. The Steam hardware survey shows that the most popular GPU is still the RTX 3060, not even the Ti version that I have. So many people are going to have that same crappy 1080p medium experience that I was with my son's PC. So what's the point of all of this? Well, I think we have a few points to make. Well, we'll start with the clickbait of this video. Do the graphics in Bioshock Infinite really compare to Borderlands 4? And can you justify how expensive it is to run video games in 2025, both from the graphics processing power perspective and the wallet perspective? Well, I will admit that I'm stretching the truth if I say that Borderlands 4 isn't a few generations ahead graphically of Bioshock Infinite. I showed my wife both of these games, showed my son both of these games.
Looks like a cartoon.
That's the point.
Both the footage that I was taking as we went at 4K, running at really high frame rates, and both of them said that, well, Borderlands looked better. A mid-range GPU, the launch of Bioshock Infinite was a GTX 660 Ti, and it had 2 gigabytes of RAM, and it ran at 1 gigahertz. I don't think that the step up graphically from Bioshock Infinite to Borderlands 4 really warrants the need to be running on a 5060 Ti with 16 gigs of VRAM, running at 3 gigahertz? These games aren't that far apart graphically, in my opinion. Well, Borderlands 4 is just not Crysis. It's not that amazing next level precedent that should be set, and I'm glad that people are giving a lot of pushback on the launch of Borderlands 4. Well, let's end things here with my final thoughts on playing Bioshock Infinite all the way through at 4K 400 frames a second on my 7800X3D and my RTX 5070 Ti in 2025. I think this game is great. It was ahead of its time. I think the end product is impressive considering how complicated the development was, and graphically in 2025, it gives AA games a run for their money. I loved playing through it again, even though it has some flaws, but it wears those flaws on its sleeve, and I was genuinely scared in some of the heavy combat situations where you're riding the skyhook rails. This game could still get my adrenaline going at times, and that says a lot. It's not often I actually feel like I'm riding a roller coaster at my computer screen. It's a shame that I will probably never see a remake of Bioshock Infinite, and that plans for Bioshock 4 seem to be going about as well as the development of Bioshock Infinite. A quick Google search shows that Bioshock 4 is facing development issues at Cloud Chamber Studios, with recent 2K Games executive reviews leading a major narrative overhaul and significant leadership change, including the removal of the studio, blah, blah, blah. It sounds like there's not a lot changing over there at 2K when it comes to the development of a Bioshock game. But after all is said and done, did my opinion on Bioshock Infinite change? Well, yes. Yes and no. On one hand, it is a completely frustrating mess. There's no map or waypoint system. You constantly are forced to backtrack through areas that aren't as distinct as the developers wished they were. You think Elizabeth might show you the way if you get lost, but she rarely says anything to help you, unless she's going to throw you a coin or some ammo in the middle of a battle when you don't need it. Although the movement is great and fluid, you do get hung up on chairs, NPCs, garbage cans, railings all the time, and it feels like other games kind of got that figured out. They just kind of bump you off instead of stopping you in your tracks. But despite all that, heck, I had just a heck of a lot of fun playing Bioshock Infinite, and my opinion has changed. The graphics make this game worth the 15 hours or so, it takes to play it. The story, although complicated and convoluted, is not exactly exactly as good as Bioshock 1, but it is serviceable, and it's okay not to get it all, you know? So what I guess I'm trying to say here is it's worth having a look at GOG, at your old Steam library. You know, go back and find some diamonds in the rough, some things that maybe you couldn't run at the time, but, you know, keep in mind, anything that was made before like 2018, you can probably max out these days and have another look at it, and maybe you'll gain new perspective, because the games being sold in 2025, well, they may not be trying to sell you games at all. They may be trying to sell you NVIDIA's latest Nanite RTX frame gen hardware and get you to go buy hardware, really, as much as they're trying to get you to buy a good game that they put some heart behind. I'm Timmy Joe. Thanks for listening to me talk. Hopefully we'll get another Bioshock game made in the universe someday, but I really believe it's one of my favorite games of all time, and I had a lot of fun looking back on it with you, and maybe skip the $80, $90 Borderlands 4 game and go back in your Steam library and revisit something that's free.